What's going on, my dear friends? Today in this video, let's learn and master the Angular framework's latest version. So let's get started. Hey guys, welcome to this new section where we're going to dive into really important concept in Angular, lifecycle hooks. So what are lifecycle hooks and why do we need to know about them? So let's dive in. Alright, so first thing first, what exactly are lifecycle hooks? Well, lifecycle hooks are a special method provided by Angular that allow us to tap into different stages of a component's lifecycle, from the moment a component is created to the moment it is destroyed. Angular provides hooks that let us run custom logics at specific times. Think of a component's life cycle like a human life. We have different stages: birth, growing up, adulthood, and finally the end of the life. Similarly, a component goes through different stages from creation to destruction, and Angular gives us hooks to perform actions at each stage. Now you might be wondering, why do we need these hooks? For guys, sometimes we need to set up some data or state as soon as the component is created. So sometimes we might need to perform actions when data bound properties changes. So sometimes we have to clean up the resources or subscription to avoid memory leaks when the component is destroyed. So each of these scenarios, we have to use these lifecycle hooks. Don't worry about this if you guys don't get it. You guys will get used to these in next few lectures. Alright, so now let's get an overview of the different lifecycle hooks available in Angular. So almost we have 8 different lifecycle hooks available in Angular components. The first one is the NgOnInit. So guys, this called once after the component is initialized. So the second one is NgOnChanges. So this called every time an input property changes. Next we have the ngDoCheck. This will called during every change detection run. So next, the ngAfterContentInit lifecycle hook. So this will called once after the component's content has been initialized. Next we have the ngAfterContentChecked. So this will called after every check of the component's content. Next we have the ngAfterViewInit. So this will called once after the component's view has been initialized. Next we have the ngAfterViewChecked. So guys, this will called after every check of the component's view. And last we have the NgOnDestroy. So this lifecycle hook will called just before the component is destroyed. So guys, don't worry if this seems like a lot. We are going to go through each one of these lifecycle hooks step by step with examples. So to really understand lifecycle hooks, we need to see them in action. So in next few lectures, we'll create a simple Angular component and implement these hooks one by one. So we'll log messages to the console so we can see exactly when each hooks is called. Alright, so guys, that's a brief introduction to lifecycle hooks in Angular. Understanding and using these hooks effectively is crucial for building robust and maintainable application. So in the next lectures, we'll dive deep into each lifecycle hook, see how it works and how we can use it in our components. Alright, before we dive into the lifecycle hooks, let's look at another feature in the component, which is loading and destroying components inside the browser view programmatically. So let's see this in action. As we learned in previous lectures, in order to load a component inside of the browser view, we have to add the component selector inside of the main root component, in our case inside this app component. So for this, we directly use the template file. Think if any case, if we want to load a component inside the view, when we click a button or something, or in any case if we want to render a component conditionally, how do we do that? For this we have two approaches in Angular. So the first one is the ngComponentOutlet directive. So this is a custom directive which renders components inside the browser dynamically. So let's see this and we'll move on to the next one. So inside the app component HTML file, I want to load the post list component inside of a div. So inside the app component HTML file, create a div. Now inside this, let's load the component programmatically. For this, we'll use the component outlet directive, right? So inside this div, add the directive. In Angular, all the directive starts with the asterisk symbol, right? So add that here. After this, the directive name is NgComponentOutlet. Carefully follow this capital simple letters. Now from here, let's call a method something load component. So after this, add the parentheses. So in order to work with this, we have to do two things. First, we have to add the import statement for this directive. So after that, we have to create this method. Still, this method is not created inside the component TS file. So back to the app component TS file. First, let's add the import. So inside the import decorator, add this. So the directive name is NgComponentOutlet. So select this autocomplete. This will add the import statement. So guys, this is coming with the Angular command module. So next, let's create the method. So down here, the method name is load component. So after this, parentheses and the method scope. Now from inside this method, simply return the component that we want to render inside the browser. So add the return keyword. After this, the component is this post list component. So guys, in order to work this, we have to import this to this app component. We already did this in a previous lecture. So again, we don't need to import that. So that's it. Now save this all and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, inside the browser, we can see the post list components view. This is loaded using the NgComponentOutlet. So guys, this is how we load a component inside of the view programmatically using the NgComponentOutlet directive. Alright, now let's quickly look at the second approach of this loading a component inside the view programmatically. So for this, we'll use a separate inbuilt Angular API, view content ref. So let's see this in action. Now this time I want to render the post list component view inside the browser when a user clicks a button. So for this, first thing first, let's create a button inside the app component TS file. Inside this, down here, create a button tags and the button text will be create component. Next, attach a click event binding for this. How do we do that? Very simple, just add the click event inside the brackets. After this, the method. So let's call the same previous method for this as well. So the method name is load component. After this, add the parentheses. So now we don't need the previous approach. So I'll comment this. Now go to the app component TS file. First thing first, we have to inject this view container ref to this component. So create a constructor method. Inside this parentheses, we have to add the injection. So private, create a variable something view container. After this, colon, and our module name is view container ref. So select this autocomplete. This will add the import statement. Guys, don't worry about this injection. We will learn about this in detail in the Angular services section. For now, just simply follow these steps. That's it. So now inside the load component method, which is we are calling when the load component button is pressed with this click event, right? So now inside this, let's add the code to render the post list component inside the browser view. So inside this, add this dot view container, which is this injected dependency view container ref, right? After this dot create component and the parentheses. So this method requires the component that we want to render as the parameter. So pass that inside this parenthesis. So the parameter is the post list component. That's it. So simply guys, this will render this component inside the view when we click the load component button. Alright, so save this and go to the browser. Now click on this button. As you guys can see here, this loaded the post list component inside the browser. Awesome, right? So guys, before the end of this lecture, let's see how to remove or destroy a component from the view using the same approach. So for this, also create a button inside the app component HTML file. So the button text is something remove component. Next, add the click event. From this, let's call a method something remove component. So now go to the app component is file and create the remove component method. So now inside this, let's add the code to remove the component from the view. So for this also, we will use the same view container ref. So inside this dot view container, which is the injected container ref, right? So after this, to remove a component from the view, we have to call the remove method. So after this, dot remove and add the parenthesis. So guys, simply this will remove the component that attached to this view container. That's it. So save this and go to the browser. Click on this button. This will render the post list component inside the view. Now click on the remove component. As you guys can see here, this removed the post list component from the view. Cool, right? So guys, this is how we programmatically render and remove components from the view. Alright guys, in this section we are going to talk about the first lifecycle hook in Angular, which is NgOnChanges. So what is this NgOnChanges and why do we use it? So guys, the NgOnChanges is the first lifecycle hook that Angular calls when the component is rendered. It's called whenever the data bound input properties change. This means that whenever the value of an input property in your component changes, Angular will call NgOnChanges method. So think of it like this. Imagine you are updating a profile on a social media site. Every time you change your profile picture or update your bio, the changes get saved and displayed inside the browser view. Similarly, NgOnChanges detects the changes in input properties and allow us to react to those changes immediately. So let's see how we can use this in our code. So guys, for this first, let's create a simple component. We'll call it profile component. So how do we create a new component? Guys, simply go to the VS Code integrated terminal and run this command nggc and name it profile component. Now what I want to do is I want to share the username from the app component to this new profile component. So how do we do that? For this guys, first thing first, we need a connection. So parent child. In order to do that, we have to add our new profile component inside the app component. So go to the app component HTML file and add this profile component selector, which is this app-profile. So now save this and go to the browser. This loaded the text from the profile component. Awesome. Now next, I want to define the onChanges lifecycle hook inside the profile component. So how do you do that? Very simple. So first thing first, we have to add the import statement. Only for this lecture, I will add the import statement manually. From next lecture onwards, we can do this automatically. So for this, we can use the auto import that coming with the VS Code integrated feature, right? So inside the profile component ES file, add this top here. So guys, this onChanges lifecycle hook also coming with the Angular core package. So we don't need to write a new import statement. For this, we can simply add this inside the same component import. So after this, add a comma and add our hook name onChanges. So guys, this is not onChange, it's called onChanges. So carefully follow this naming convention. Next, in order to use this hook, we have to implement to this component class. So after this component class name, add the keyword implements. After this, add our lifecycle hook on changes. Pass it same like the import we add. Carefully follow the capital simple letters, otherwise you will get unnecessary errors. So guys, what is this implement? With this, we are changing this component class shape to use this lifecycle hook, right? So now as you guys can see here, we are getting this error saying there is missing this NgOnChanges property in this onChanges lifecycle hook. So in order to use this, we need this method NgOnChanges declared inside this component. So down here inside the class scope, let's define the method. The method name is NgOnChanges. So carefully follow these capital simple letters. Next, the method parentheses and the method scope. Now inside this method, we can add the code to run when this onChanges lifecycle hook triggered. So for now, just let's log a message so we can actually see when this method will trigger. So inside this, add the console.log. Inside this, set the message something onChanges triggered. Now save this and go to the browser. Now inside the browser console, we got nothing here. Why is that? Can you guys guess? Guys, as I said, in order to trigger this NgOnChanges hook, there must be something that should change on an input property. Now in our case, inside of this profile component, still we don't have any input properties. So that's why this method is not triggered. Alright, so now let's try to trigger this onChanges method. So now I want to send the username from the app component or the parent component to this child component. So how do we do that? For this, we can use the input decorator, right? So let's do this. So guys, first thing first, we need the variable to store the username. So go to the app component TS file and create a new variable, something username. So set this type as string and set a default value something John Doe. Next, let's send this username to the profile or the child component. How do we do that? We simply bind that to this component selector. So inside this, add square brackets and add a new input variable named something p username. So this p stands for parent, right? So next, assign this to the username variable that we define inside this app component. Now we are getting this compile error because still we are not declared this input variable inside the profile component. So go to the profile component and create this variable. Guys, this must be an input variable. So add the input decorator. So how do we add that? We'll define a decorator using the @ symbol, right? So add @ symbol after this input. So this I is capital. After this, add the parentheses. Now next, add the variable name that we added inside the profile component selector, which is this p username. So add that here. After this, add the variable type as string. Perfect. So guys, before we move on, let's render this input variable inside the browser. So inside the profile component HTML file, add the string interpolation and render this p username inside this. Awesome. So save this and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, we got the username inside the browser. Now let's look at inside the browser console. As you guys can see here, this time inside the console, we got this NgOnChanges triggered message, which means this time the NgOnChanges method triggered somehow. Can you guys guess what happened here? So guys, nothing much here. Now we have an input property inside our profile component. So this onChanges hook will automatically trigger when this input property changed. So at the initial stage of this component, we declared this input variable. Once this loaded, we sent the username value to this component via binding to this input variable from the parent component. So in that case, this input variable value changes. So if the input variable value changes, this NgOnChanges hook will trigger. So that's how we got this log printed inside the browser view. Wait, I'll show you another example. Let's change this username value dynamically when clicking a button. So for this, first thing first, create this button inside the component HTML file. Set the button text something. Change username. Now from this button, let's call a method in click event. So bind the click event. Inside this, call a method something. Change user. After this, don't forget to add the parentheses. Now go to the AppComponent.ts file and create the change user method. So now inside this method, change the username value to something, John Smith. Now save this all and go to the browser. Inside the console, we can see the initial OnChanges hooks log. Now click on this button, change user. As you guys can see here, when I click the button, this changes the username value to John Smith. And inside the browser console, again we can see the second OnChanges log, which means for the second time also the NgOnChanges hook triggered. How this happened? Because guys, this time again we are changing the input value of the profile component. So when we change this username inside the app component, the Angular change detection mechanism will detect this change and automatically send the new value to the child component's input variable. So that's how we can see the updated username variable loaded inside the browser. So when this input username value changed, NgOnChanges hook will detect this input property changes and triggered this NgOnChanges lifecycle hook. So that's how we got this log printed inside the browser view for the second time as well. So hope you guys got the idea. Alright guys, so once again, the NgOnChanges is a powerful lifecycle hook that let us react to changes in input properties. Whenever an input property changes, Angular calls NgOnChanges, allowing us to handle the change and update our component accordingly. So this is especially useful for handling dynamic data and keeping our components in sync with changes. I think that's it for NgOnChanges lifecycle hook. So guys, keep practicing using examples to get a better understanding of how it works. So in the next section, we'll cover the NgOnInit lifecycle hook and see how it works with the Angular components. So let's move on to the next lecture.